This episode's made possible by Planful.
Hello! On today's episode of Planning Aces, we're pleased to feature the FP&A insights and commentary of three distinguished finance leaders. They are CFO Sandeep Aujla of Intuit, CFO Shelagh Glaser of Synopsys, and CFO Seth Wunder of Acorns. This is Jack Sweeney, your co-host, along with performance management guru Brett Knowles, who will serve as our resident thought leader as we seek to highlight the takeaways from our distinguished group of Planning Aces. We'll begin after this.
Hi, I'm Rowan Tonkin, Chief Marketing Officer at Planful, and we're a proud sponsor of CFO Thought Leader. At Planful, we're empowering teams just like yours to drive peak financial performance in every corner of your business. What sets Planful apart? We have purpose-built applications for every department, from FP&A to accounting, marketing to HR, all with built-in financial intelligence. This means we can get you up and running within weeks, and it requires minimal IT involvement. So you can rapidly and seamlessly engage everyone across the business in your key financial processes. Best of all, you can't outgrow us. We take the pain of growing away with an unmatched ability to scale with you. You have an endless runway with Planful. See why over 1,300 customers around the world choose Planful as their flexible, user-friendly, end-to-end financial performance management platform. Go to planful.com and see how you can make financial performance a team sport in your business.
Hi, it's Jack, and we're here with Brett Knowles, who I think you're still in transit, Brett. Where exactly are you?
Yeah, so I literally flew back in this morning. I've just got off the plane.
And I'll point out that Brett is returning from a business trip to Zanzibar. I mentioned that. I don't know too many business consultants who who have that on their route. But we're very pleased you made time for us under the circumstances.
Well, it's important that I make time for you.
Well, no disagreement there.
So how long does it take to get to Zanzibar?
It takes about 24 hours of plane time, plus eventually you got to do a transfer somewhere or the other. So actually, I did a transfer on the way back through Dubai. And I had a 10-hour layover, but the Dubai airport puts most malls to shame. So if you're going to spend 10 hours somewhere, you might as well be somewhere that's pretty luxurious and enjoy yourself.
Nice. How were the accommodations in Zanzibar?
What's interesting about Zanzibar is it reminds me of what Bali was like 30 years ago. So it's still rustic, fabulous beaches and so on, but it's just, you can tell it's just at the cusp of huge investment from, Marriott's and Hilton's and, tourist places. Like it's just beginning to have some of those places built, but it's still at this point in time, taking a step back in time to a nice rustic, like for example, in the hotels, if you order a meal, someone fills out a paper chit. And when you go to check out, they have that stack of chits and they go through each one and add them up and so on, just like the old days.
And it's obvious the future will be tourism there. There isn't any other contributor to the GDP or the...
No, not really. There's no natural resources. So there's nothing that you can just get for free. There's a fair amount of agriculture there, but it's not quite a desert, but it's awfully close to being desert-like. So, I think tourism is going to be the main thing. On the other hand, the good thing about tourism is it's a pretty sustainable business.
Compared to...
in theory, oil and gas, right? Eventually you drain off all the oil and gas. They will always have those sandy beaches. Now, maybe, and their beaches are big enough that even with global warming, they're still going to have sandy beaches.
Yeah, lots of beach, I guess, huh? Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you to share what the common thread is across our three planning aces, but let me just give my quick snapshot of the three planning aces this episode. Again, we begin with Sandeep Aujla, CFO of Intuit, who you'll hear him emphasizing the importance of intellectual horsepower, curiosity, and ambition in talent acquisition. And then we'll hear from Shelagh Glaser, CFO of Synopsys. Sheila highlights the importance of strategic finance by connecting strategy, investment with outcomes. And then we'll hear from Seth Wunder, CFO of Acorns. And Seth discusses the importance of evolving team structures and fostering a collaborative culture to prevent duplication of work as a company grows. Well, those are my encapsulations. What is the common thread here, though? What is it that you see?
I think the commonality with the three people that we're going to listen to is all about communication. How is it in FP&A we can communicate with our internal and external stakeholders? And of course, that communication is important because a lot of the work we do is either providing them with advice or trying to get information from them in order to do our work and provide them with advice. And so if you don't have those communication skills, it doesn't matter how good your technical skills are, you're still not going to get the data and insights that you need to effectively do good FP&A work.
Well, I think we'll begin with Sandeep Aujla, CFO of Intuit, who was on our episode recently, 1016, number 1016. When Sandeep Aujla joined Intuit back in 2015, he had already spent years in investment banking, something like 7 years, and there was another 7 years at Visa, where he was a senior finance executive, sort of edging closer to a CFO role. Yet it took 8 more years before he became Intuit's CFO. Aujla's deliberate choice to stay at Intuit allowed him to really enter the FP&A quarries, if you will, and gain crucial experience from building what is really today a forward-thinking finance team that deeply engages with business operations. Or so we learned when we talked to Sandeep on episode 1016. In any case, we're pleased to feature Sandeep as one of this episode's planning aces. Here he is.
Absolutely, and it's been a journey. So I have a head of business unit finance. We don't call them CFOs, but in essence, you would consider them segment level CFOs. And these are very seasoned leaders that lead large teams, one for the small business group, one for Credit Karma, one for consumer group. And what I look for in talent are three things: intellectual horsepower, intellectual curiosity, and a ton of ambition. Those are the three things I can't teach people. Everything else I can teach. So one of the things I've done since I joined Intuit in 2015 is I've turned FP&A from being comprised 90% plus of folks that kind of had a similar background. They grew up through the finance organization, to where when you look at my top leaders now, some of them came up through the finance organization, some of them came up through the engineering organizations, some came up through investment banking, some came up through consulting. Because those three key ingredients I'm looking for, those comes in multiple shapes. And what I've realized is the art of finance is really an art of deeply understanding the business, being accretive to every conversation. You're adding value, putting growth points on the board, and you just happen to sit in the finance function, but your role really is to be that business leader. So many of the finance leaders I have today, if you close your eyes, and it's one of the mandates I have for them, is when I close my eyes and I listen to that conversation, I shouldn't be able to tell who's in finance, who's in product, who's in marketing, who's in which other function. And so the FP&A team has evolved tremendously. I'm just kind of thinking real time here. I would say uh, at least 2/3 of the team that I ran the small business group when I was leading that function, now in the CFO team, is there's been a turnover just because we have really up leveled the talent to be a team that, of course, they nail the art of finance, but they're really engaging as a growth catalyst in the business and bringing very tangible growth ideas to the table. We declare 3 growth imperatives that are critical for any platform company to continue to grow. First is breakthrough customer growth. Are we growing customers both at the low end and the top end? Because as you focus on mid-market, you got to make sure you're also not taking your eye off the core of the business, the low end. Otherwise, you're opening yourself up for disruption. So that's one. Second is breakthrough adoption. Those customers coming in, are they adopting multiple parts of your platform? Otherwise, you're just being a single product company if you are still just leading with QuickBooks. They should be buying QuickBooks and then quickly attaching payments, payroll, getting capital loans from us. They should be getting the taxes done through TurboTax and adopting Credit Karma Money. So what's the breakthrough adoption? And the third, better together. By having this suite of assets, are we driving the opportunity for customers that are adopting multiple parts of the platform and they are getting experiences that are better by being on a platform versus what they would do outside by getting those point solutions? So I have a series of metrics. There's about 15 in total across those 3 that we tend to look at, and they relate to the progress we're making quarter-over-quarter and year-over-year. But if I look at the Uber metric, is I look at what's the overarching growth rate of the company, and what's the overarching operating income margin of the company. And I look, we are a company, if you look at our growth rate and our latest guidance of 13% and our margin, operating income margin of 39% plus, we're a company operating at the rule of 52. There are very few companies delivering 16 billion plus in revenues operating at that rule. And we look at where we are, where our peer large cap software companies are tracking. And what I focus on with the leadership team, the CEO staff team, is how are we making sure on that metric we are one of the best run software companies out there.
All right. The rule of 52, Brett. What did you make of what Sandeep Aujla shared with us?
I thought it was very interesting to listen to him because I've been an Intuit QuickBooks user for about the last 20 years or as long as I've been in business, I think. And so it's kind of fun hearing something from the inside story. And on the business side, his drive towards making us multi-product customers. And that's a common theme. Like a key metric often is how many of our customers have multiple products. Like AT&T, I want you to have your phone system, your landline, plus a long distance program, plus internet, plus. And they measure how many people have multiple products. And so that's the journey that Intuit's on. How do I get people to have multiple products, like their lending capabilities and different software products? So I thought that was interesting, just on a personal level, to hear that journey. What I thought was interesting is when he began to describe the sort of people he looks for his FP&A team. And to remind you, he wants that intellectual horsepower, but he also wants curiosity and ambition. And his story was, I can't teach you curiosity and ambition. You have to come to us with those. Now, we could debate that all day long. What I think is a truism is, for every organization, when you begin to design your FP&A, you need to think about what things are minimal entry-level things that you must have. In his case, he used the criteria of, I can't train them. There might be other reasons to choose minimal criteria. And then also clearly define what things you're willing to train people on. We all have so many candidates. How do we better filter them? And and I know I'm rambling here, but part of the challenge with finding employees these days is AI. So a common technique used is we give people business cases and they're supposed to answer them. And I use that to evaluate their capability. The dilemma is we now know everyone would hire ChatGPT because 98% of the applicants have used AI to try to answer those questions. Things like curiosity and ambition, you can't get through ChatGPT and they can't sort of cheat on it. So I think those are interesting attributes. So looping right back to what I said before is what are the gives and gets? What must you get for a candidate to even be qualified? What are you willing to give on? In other words, what are you willing to train around? So that was one bucket of learnings.
What do you think when he refers to strategic finance and this strategic finance function? I've begun to probe a little more when I hear a finance leader use that expression, because I'll say, well, what is it? What distinguishes a strategic finance function from the traditional one? And we've gotten a variety of different answers. He was pretty specific about the types of individuals who are part of that.
Yeah, that certainly those are two different buckets. Like, I don't think that's his answer to what a strategic finance person is. I think that was an answer to what's happened to make his workforce more diverse, right? He said that basically that was part of the story of what's happened over his 8 years. And the story is they've largely changed who's in his team, and they're looking for, this curiosity, ambition, and so on. It's when he came in, they were 90% similar players. He now has much better diversity. And I know that he's talking about diversity of thought. It's not culture diversity or sex or, religion. It's how do you get diverse thinking around the table? And that's super important, because if everyone is aligned, then you're not getting interesting new ideas as we have meetings, right? The purpose of a meeting is to get access to those different brains. If all those brains are saying the same things, then don't invite those people to the meeting. I'm not learning anything new from them. The fact he's pushing towards diversity is that curiosity and ambition thing. I think his question about strategic would be more, do they understand what our strategy is, and can they apply that moment to moment in questions in front of them? So this strategy is all about diversity of products. And, what he said is people need to deeply understand the value add at each step and behave like a business leader, right? His interesting quote was, I should be able to close my eyes and not tell who the finance person is around the table. And so, that's what we're trying to get, that someone that is contributing strategically, not contributing because you're a finance person. And so how is it we can answer any question in light of that increase in their product mix idea, as opposed to it's got to achieve a certain ROI or a certain growth rate, certain operating margin number. Now, he's still looking for those are his two key metrics, but he wants people to participate based on Intuit's strategy about diversification of products.
One of the things I found interesting is Intuit is now going up in mid-sized customers. Frequently we hear about someone servicing large or enterprise who come down, and they can afford to do so because there's so many digital tools that can now service people online that it's not like they have to dedicate a team to help service small, medium accounts.
Yeah, and I don't think that's unusual, right? Whether you're trying to migrate down, so from large accounts down to small, or we talked about it before, like even Mercedes beginning to do smaller cards and those baby Benzes, trying to enter a new market but not diluting the brand. There's gravity and pull the other direction as well. You're a small organization, or you deal with small SMB companies, but as those companies grow, they would like to not switch their accounting system. If I'm using QuickBooks, I'd like to be able to keep using it, but I bump into different functional walls. One wall is just the number of users it can support. Maybe it can support 100 users, but can't support 1,000, or can support 1,000, but not 10,000. Others is the more diverse functionality that's required as the business gets more complicated. FP&A is a good example. how is it we get better planning tools embedded in the financial instrument, so I don't need to move to an Anaplan or something sooner. So there's that, but I've got to build that functionality before I can hit those markets. So I think what we're hearing is they've been investing in building that functionality. Now they want to begin seeing the benefits of that investment by larger clients and customers.
Well, we'll tee up our next planning ace, who will be Shelagh Glaser, CFO of Synopsys. Sheila was with us on episode 1018. 29-year career investment with Intel Corp. Resided in the finance function there, had all sorts of senior finance roles, multiple unit CFO roles at Intel. Steps out of Intel to become CFO of Zendesk originally, and then on to Synopsys. Standout episode for us. So please check it out if you haven't heard it already. But right now, here's Shelagh Glaser.
To me, it's a combination of FP&A and the data analytics. And so really thinking about how do we connect strategy to investment to outcome. And a lot of times, and we've just gone through an exercise, or I call it inspect the base. A lot of times inside organizations, investments end up flourishing, and they might not relate back to the strategy, and they might not relate back to business outcomes. Because in a large organization, and we're a large organization, we have 20,000 people, you start something and things continue. So you really have to sometimes step back and make sure we have a strategic intent, we have a long-term plan, and we have an investment plan. Are these things all linked together in the most efficient way? Or would we be better if we could move some investment from project A to project B? And to me, that comes from a strategic finance lens, because we can just simply forecast this group has 100 people, it needs 200 people. Okay, but why? Why do we need 200 people? What are we in service of? What are we trying to do? What's the opportunity? And to me, that's part of strategic finance, understanding the strategy, linking then the investment, and then being really clear about what the outcomes are supposed to be. It's really not interesting that I spent the money. Check. Everybody can spend money. That's not the hard part. The hard part is spending the money and getting the business outcome, and making sure that, as you're getting the business outcome, you're folding that learning back in. How next time can we do that for, even fewer resources? Well, I mean, the obvious metrics, I think, are, revenue and operating margin. Those are obvious metrics. And when I first came, there was this sort of sense of, well, it's one or the other. One, and, obviously it's an and, right? That's adulthood. Adulthood is all about and. You have to do all these things. So how do we raise that metric, and how do we have that be more top of mind for people? And then I would say that, the other thing is that, was really clear in how we talked, and, it's one of the things that I changed when I came is, our investor relations, is it was really confusing to describe our business to the outside world. And it was, we understood the business, but it was then a little bit complicated to understand. And that was because the business had evolved so much, but we hadn't evolved our segment reporting. So one of the things that I did when I first came is work with the CEO to evolve our segment reporting. So it really reflected how we manage the business internally, but also helped illuminate to our investors the strength of our different business operations. And so we've got a business called Design Automation, which is the tools that you think about. And then we've got a business called Design IP, which, think about that. A chip is made of IP blocks. Think about that as we make some of those Lego blocks for people. And they're very different financial profiles, but they're very important businesses, and we want to be able to communicate that. So that was one of the things that we elevated, and we spend lots of time with investors making sure they understand, and then it helps to articulate inside the company too, so people can focus on its slightly different set of metrics that we manage those two businesses on.
I liked what she was talking about, and I guess you gave us a bit of a hint. Strategic investments, and her whole story, of course, was it's important that her team takes a look at all activities through the lens of that strategic investment idea. And in particular, she was concerned about the disconnect she often sees between investments and what the strategy calls for. And she described that inertia, my word, not hers, where you launch a project, you put a bunch of money into it, and it tends to take on a life of its own. How is it when to pull the cord on a project or invest more in a project? And she expects her team to be mindful of the strategy, not blindly going forward saying, well, that's what was in the plan, so we better go do it.
It seems like she wants to really help the investment world understand why these different areas or segments contribute meaningful amounts and need to be understood clearly if a particular quarter looks a little different from the next.
Yeah. One of the challenges we have in FP&A is the diverse stakeholders that we communicate with. So the communication you just outlined, Jack, to outside investors, I have to describe things in one way. How we describe it internally might be the same thing, but translated slightly differently. And she's a good example of that. Internally, she's about that focus on outcomes. Well, you can't take that to market, but internally, it's a clearer message to say, make sure these investments are delivering on the outcomes that were in mind when we charter that project. And those outcomes might be best delivered by a change in that project, killing that project and doing something else and so forth. But that's not what you say to the outside investors, right? The outside investors, as you pointed out, is all about what are the channels that we're getting, how we're getting traction in the channels. So it's a translation, internal versus external, but we need to make sure that we're still looking at one view of the truth, even though I'm translating it. It's no different than describing your children to their teacher compared to describing the children to their soccer coach, right? There's completely different attributes you give to those two different stakeholders because they're interested in different attributes of that child.
Part of, as you might know, part of my questions to the finance leaders, I'm always trying to have them come up forward with a metric or a number that they have somehow educated their companies about differently, or they realized a certain metric wasn't getting the love it deserved. And I thought almost as a response, but she clearly wanted to make known that at times in conversations, it's almost like metrics get siloed. And she wanted to reject the notion that these metrics are mutually exclusive. And sometimes in meetings or places, that's how they're discussed. And she used the example of revenue and operating margin and how improvements to both, how they're interrelated.
Yeah, in fact, I really loved her rebuttal. I thought my mother was in the room where she said, it's about and, not or, and is about adulthood. And I just heard my mom saying the same thing, 40 years ago. But that's her point. It's about and we keep on doing or. Like you get margin or you get revenue. And I agree. There's an old adage that for any product, you want cost, quality, and time. Choose any two, right? You have cost and quality, or you can have time and cost. And so, but if you think of McDonald's, it's a great example of where you get all three, right? Consistent quality. It's always, within the time structure that you're promised, and always at the right cost, right? It's got cost, quality, and time. And they do it consistently, and they optimize all three all the time. It's an and world, not an or world. And we tend to choose the or world because it's the easy out, revenue or margin. And she's saying, no, put on your big boy pants and get us both.
I would think the professionals, the finance professionals, the seasoned finance professionals who are represented both on Sandeep's team and Sheila's team look a lot alike. Or would you disagree?
I suppose that they do, but I wouldn't know. Like Sandeep pushed how important curiosity and ambition is, whereas her focus was on that strategic finance and business outcomes. So chances are if you put them in a room and they had a debate, they're describing two sides of the same coin, but they do happen to use different words. And we have seen in different organizations, they choose different types of people. An example, a simple example that's not true in every case would be the sort of FP&A person I have in the pharma industry is different than what I would have in a marketing company's activities, because a pharma company is very risk averse, high cost, and a lot of structure to make sure that we get those billions of dollars in drug pipeline back. Whereas in a marketing company, you can change the product on a dime, very creative. Every customer wants something different from you. And so in the pharma company, I can have far more structure and need far less creativity. On the marketing company, I might need different attributes. So in these cases, you might be right only because those two businesses are more similar than different. But I don't think you can extrapolate that to, and all other companies of the same size would have the same common characteristics of the employees.
Yeah, well, from a geographic point of view, they're roughly about a 10-minute drive from each other. One's in Sunnyvale, the other's in Mountain View, Silicon Valley.
Well, certainly their thinking is similar, whether they're physically close together or not. It takes a certain mindset to be successful in those larger organizations. And you not only need the FP&A sense, but you need the political sense to be successful amongst those other executives, and also the willing to play that game. So I think it's not a random choice of CFOs. You described Sandeep, for example, of, he chose to stay with Intuit because he thought there might be some career opportunity for him that he was searching for. Well, that's a choice, and not everyone's willing to make that choice. So you end up with a less diverse population when I have a similar business, similar size, similar thinking, and so forth. You're just not getting that variety in place. And it makes it more interesting when you get a wild card, like OpenAI is a good example. Even Google in the early days, they had very different financial players than was typical for companies of their size or their location.
All right. Well, our third planning ace for this episode is CFO Seth Wunder of Acorns, the investing platform. Seth emphasized, as you'll hear, what it takes to create a culture of collaboration. I wish we could have talked a little more about it with him, but here's Seth Wunder.
There's a couple of things that we've tried to evolve on over let's say the last year or two. One is, now that we have a larger business, you don't want the same team that was here and the same team and the team that you acquired all doing functionally the same things, right? Because that's duplicating work. So how do you build a culture of collaboration in order to help people advance in their careers by taking on broader responsibilities or different responsibilities? So somebody who is hyper-focused in a product segment, and you're like, that's amazing. But if I can get you to think at a higher level and have somebody work with you and create a laddering of team architecture, it gives somebody a chance to manage. It gives someone a chance to more strategically think across the business, and you try to repeat that process. It could be any constituent that is around the company. You start to realize that everyone's got different domain expertise, and not everyone is familiar with this. And so you've got to learn how to speak in common language. You have to learn how to break things down into simple explanatory building blocks so people can follow you along. And it would be no different than if I was in an engineering meeting and they wanted to tell me what was going on in their space, and they got deep into architecture of code and other things that might be irrelevant or just not my domain expertise. Same thing that applies here. And I see the mistake being made time and time again. So one of the things we work on the team with is repetition of communication, simplification of messaging, allow for people for follow-ups, graphics, and so forth. And so that was a real learning experience for me, especially coming from the investor backdrop. You mentioned investment banking before. When you work in finance, everyone around you understands finance. I mean, it's common, right? And so it fosters a technical language set that's not transferable or shouldn't be transferable to working at a corporate enterprise. And so unwinding those behavior patterns for me and learning how to, and I'm still learning all the time, but learning how to speak in simplified ways about complex matters was just a fundamental transition. So that would be my observation from day one.
Well, thank you, Seth Wunder, who, by the way, will be featured on episode 1020. I think I'm going to start saying 1020. Episode 1020. But what did you make of what Seth shared with us?
Well, I think it was interesting because he's different than the last two that we heard. And we just finished off saying that the last two were more similar than different just because of the enterprises and size, scale, all that kind of stuff. And he has similar problems, but on a completely different scale. So yes, he's trying to get that diversity of thinking, but his example was he's getting a bunch of people through acquisitions that companies made. And obviously, when you're a smaller company and you make an acquisition of a similar sized company, I have a huge pile of duplication. And one of the reasons you did the acquisition was to get synergies and economies of scale. So now you need to begin making choices about what teams we use or what players we use. And a common mistake is you just take a whole team in holus bolus. In other words, I make an acquisition and I decide, for the case of an interesting conversation, the acquired company has a better FP&A team. I'm just going to use them and get rid of my current staff. Or the opposite. I think I've got the better FP&A team. I'll just get rid of the staff from the acquired company. And he's talking about mixing and matching. How is it I choose amongst that new inventory of people, which ones have the characteristics that we're looking for? And of course, he talked about trying to get no duplication and getting that culture of collaboration. So, and those become important things at the scale he's at, right? If I do an acquisition and I choose half from one team, half from the other, how do I make sure that they're going to collaborate together? Or if I just only bring one or two people in from the others, you can understand what those challenges are like in a smaller business, different than what the last two speakers. Where the common ground is, what he said is, we need to learn how to communicate, even though we've got sort of a different language and different expertise. So there's common ground, but he's got the same issue that you have with a large company is far more impactful at a small company. And so I think that was the interesting part, to see the differences and the common ground.
With smaller businesses, when they're being acquired, there are a lot of unique characteristics versus larger businesses.
Whereas if you are integrating larger businesses together, they've already become more homogeneous over the years anyways, because you just need that when you get to that scale and you're getting in a bunch of people from other organizations. You also need to work much more on forming a company culture when you're a large company like Synopsys, as opposed to a small one like Acorn. So he's bumping into things that he doesn't have existing structures to use. There is no existing set of values or beliefs or training on how we behave. There may not be standard business processes you use. Whereas, when you join Intuit, they're going to have their list of values and their behaviors. They're going to have their list of processes that you have to use and so on. So you end up with a different type of person in those smaller businesses and a different mix of processes. And when companies move up that grade from small to larger, eventually they've got to come up with those things. They've got to develop their value statements and their policies and their processes. And it moves from chaos to something that's more organized. So that's what he's playing with, trying to get that organization in place. What's interesting is where he came from, that organization was in place, and he came to an organization where clearly it was not. If we take a look at it, our last two people, they came from large corporations like Intel to another large corporation. So they came from organizations where there was all those, set values, behaviors, training programs, and so on, to a new one with set values, training programs. There might be slightly different values or different processes and software they're using, but all those structures are in place. He's going into one where it's chaos and anarchy, and he's trying to gradually build those processes. So there's similarities, like he talks about how we're trying to get that more, what we have been talking about, that strategic financial perspective, but he's coming from a different set of building blocks that he's heading in that direction.
So 3 different finance leaders facing different sets of challenges, really. Communication is the common thread, I think. I would agree with you. But what are some of the other takeaways then? When we place their commentary side by side like this, what would those be?
I think the more important thing I take from this is any FP&A person, leader, needs to decide what are what I call the give and gets. The gets are, what must I have? So Sandeep talks about curiosity and so forth. I must have that. That's the get. If I don't get that, you're not a candidate. And the gives, what are the things I would like to have, but if you don't have it, I'm ready to give that up. So examples, again, from Sandeep's world, that you could train someone around. So he said, I can't get that ambition, that curiosity. You got to come to the table with that. I can train you for the other stuff. And that's his perspective. I think each of us needs to almost have a 2-column sheet. What are the things that a candidate needs to have? And what are the things that you would like them to have, but you're willing to have some give on those topics? I think the other attribute that no one touched on here that I mentioned earlier on is, I think how we recruit people is broken. How we recruit people worked before AI came along. So again, a common approach right now is I give candidates a business, I do all the clearing. Once I've got the short list, I give them a series of cases to work on, and then we have a debate. And the dilemma is, like we're seeing in universities, people can just use AI to do those business cases. The attributes that Sandeep was looking for of curiosity don't come out in those business cases. There are many other cognitive tests available. I'm merely saying the way that we have been doing recruiting doesn't match what we've talked about in this podcast, nor does it match what is the reality in the real world. It's a dilemma because in larger organizations like Intuit, you're stuck with whatever HR is giving you as the right hiring process. And that might not work for us in FP&A. And so you may need to ask permission to have a different way to hire your staff than HR is requiring for sales reps or developers or other staff members.
Well, Brett, we're going to leave it there. And I imagine it's almost time for you to head back to Zanzibar.
I would hope I go back to Zanzibar. Like, it's always gratifying, whether you're working with a company and you can see it make a difference, or even more so. We've done quite a few countries. Now, they're all small countries like Singapore, but it's always gratifying to see societal change as we move things forward. So I'd love to go back there. And it's so easy to help people move ahead, especially when we've blazed those trails for 40 years and they don't need to make all the mistakes we made. We did a project once in Indonesia, and they were saying what's interesting about Indonesia is they didn't have to lay down copper wires for landline phones. They went, straight from some people had landline phones to everyone has a cell phone. So now, 310 million people have phones, whereas we could never have done that if we had to lay down copper to get there. What I'm seeing in Zanzibar is a different leap in technology that if I take a look at other countries over there, we've worked in like Bahrain and Oman, they've worked hard to build a educated constituency. So they've been firing their students off to Europe and to US to get college degrees so that they can come back to Bahrain and Oman and help out. Zanzibar doesn't have to do that. Zanzibar can now make that leap like from landlines to cell phones using AI. So they can use AI to close the competency gaps they don't have. So in our world, you could say we want to measure, the stability of power coming out of our power generator. I can ask ChatGPT, give me 10 metrics for measuring stability of power, and it will come back with those 10 metrics. But before, we would have to rely on a bunch of engineers who've gone through 5 years of education to come up with that same list. And it's arguable in some cases, Chat actually comes up with a better list because it's not looking at what 5 engineers came up with, but 5,000 engineers. So they have this opportunity to make this leap forward, and that's quite interesting. The application, though, is every business is the same. We used to have scales of economy in a larger company. We had more engineers to deal with those questions and more salespeople and so on. AI is allowing smaller companies to close that gap. I don't need the collection of engineers to come up with a collection of engineers' potential answers and solutions to problems. So it's fun to see in a country like Zanzibar, but what's invisible to us, I think, is the gap between what large companies can do and what small companies can do is rapidly getting compressed with AI. And I think that would be an interesting conversation for us to have with some FP&A people going forward.
And just to stick with our communication discussion, it just seems to me that as a consultant and advisor to so many different types of companies as well as governments, that you have stepped into these environments over time. And sometimes it's what you leave behind that is most valuable isn't necessarily the framework or the blueprint of what you mapped out, but it might be the language. You started talking about things in a different fashion that suddenly individuals or part of the team began to adopt, and somehow it changed the priorities or allowed people to begin thinking differently. In a way, that's what consultants are known for.
The framework behind what you're talking about is every problem has a combination of social and technical requirements. And so we assume in the accounting it's highly technical, low social. And the conversations we've been having with our FP&A people is maybe it's not all technical, maybe it's more social. So it's a social tech problem, what the mix is. The overlay on consulting is this, and this is based on some work from BJ Fogg that basically says, to make changes happen in the organization, an employee needs 2 things, ability and motivation. So if you have an ability but no motivation, like you have a university degree but you're not motivated, you can't move things forward. Or if you got great motivation and no skills, you can't move things forward. I need both those things. And in different clients, you sometimes show up where they've got great ability and no motivation, and other times they got great motivation and no ability. So as you show up as an external force, and this is no different than being a new FP&A manager, you got to figure out where they are on those 2 axes and what things you need to do to move forward. And BJ Fogg's argument is 2 things. One is you have to nudge both forward. You can't work all on motivation and ignore ability or the opposite. And then the second is you got to do it in small steps. You can't suddenly go, we're going to go implement more sophisticated planning software. You've got to take some small steps to go there. The metaphor of if you want to run a marathon, first you should walk for a while, then jog, and then run farther. And eventually you can work up to a marathon. Many of these big changes we need to make, we hope we can just bring in a consultant and leap up the ability and motivation thing and end up at that that point just by throwing money at McKinsey? And the answer is no, you can't. You still have to work on both things, and it largely has to come internally. So those external forces, or you as a new FP&A person, can structure that stuff, but you've got to move forward slowly. And when I loop back to your initial comment, one of the problems you have with a consultant is it's a fast burn. You throw in a bunch of money, you want that work done very quickly. That's not sustainable. You can't come in and suddenly start running a marathon. You need to go through that journey. So often that internal person has a better accountability for making those changes happen over time. You're going to bring in a point-in-time nudge on the ability or the motivation side, digest that, and then bring in that consultant again to take you the next nudge. But don't try to do it all at once.
Well, we are not a podcast for consulting or consultants, but we do keep in mind that FP&A professionals, in many ways, and in many of their engagements where they get sent out or embedded, they're very much like a consultant. So I do think some of what you shared about the world of consulting is very applicable to many of the FP&A professionals out there. They might find it interesting. So that's why I asked. And once more, I want to thank Brett Knowles. And we are way over time, so we're going to say goodbye to you now.